front of you. Boost, 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 moving up and down again. Men go mad with watching them. There's no discharge in the war. If your eyes drop, they will get the top of you. Boost, 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 moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. Rise, to think of something different. Oh, my God, keep from going lunatic. Moving up and down again. There's no discharge in the war. 7, 6, 11, 5, 4, 17, 32 the day before.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the the Supernatural Truth. We went through a name change. It's my very great pleasure to welcome back one of my favorite guests, one of my favorite people in the one of my favorite authors, Mr. Gary Wayne. What's up, brother?
Happy to be back, and
happy to have you.
Looking forward to the conversation, and hopefully we'll entertain and elucidate the audience at the same time if we're on our game. If not, well, it'll still be fun.
Yeah, we gave it a try. Congratulations as well on the audio book and the book doing so well. Mm-hmm. You deserve every last accolade you get.
Well, thank you for that. And hopefully as more people get a hold of the book, they'll start to sort of appreciate not my writing, but the Bible more, and that there's, in the old saying, there's always more to the story. So, and here's the rest of the story, so to speak. And I think it's so important for people to understand that, so that they understand the context of their belief system. They understand why we're here. What's our raison d'etre, our reason for being. And that's what I try and sort of get out there, and then also tell a story through facts. And in this case, to bring the Old Testament to life and make the end time understandable.
Absolutely. Now, I remember on the last show, you said that you wanted to do a book that was strictly on eschatology at some point.
Yeah, it won't be strictly eschatology. Maybe I'll eventually get there, but it's be heavier weighted to eschatology. So, and the thing is so much of prophecy is based on prehistory. So book 3 will be about the Holy Covenant, and sort of briefly in the beginning about the building blocks to what becomes the complete Holy Covenant with Israel, the violations of those covenant, the dispersions of the northern tribes being lost, and the trials that Judah will go in. They're still visible, but suffered the same curses of the covenant, and why we're living through the curses of the covenant. But to bring that forward from the beginning and understand that Abraham, he moves to Canaan, into the land of the giants. So it's always interconnected. But then to bring in the end time prophecies based out of the Holy Covenant about the gathering of Israel in the second Exodus and the reconciliation in the end time, and how that's a parallel track to the Christian and sort of church prophecies, and to keep those separate. And so I'll talk about how to keep those separate. And it's not all that complicated, but it's important to do and understand that there's a nexus point at the supper of the Lamb.
Amen. Eschatology has always been pretty rough for me. And you'll see a lot of people on shows like we've done and whatnot. They'll go in the comment section, and I've seen people break fellowship over their interpretation of eschatology. So I can't wait for that book to come out so you can actually give people an anvil on which to pound that steel out on.
Yeah, and they'll get a good dose in book 2, and they'll actually put down how my approach works and what my strict guidelines are to try and keep me on the straight and narrow. And I find it concerning that Christians raise different understanding of prophecy to a faith issue. I mean,
right.
I don't think it ought to be. We just have to recognize there is prophecy. and we ought to try and understand it if we can as part of the learning process. But we ought to be able to agree and disagree respectfully in Christianity.
Absolutely.
And there's many different approaches to eschatology. I think they're all preconceived agendas, but as opposed to, just letting prophecy just come together. It's once you get sort of the template, it works fairly easily. But there's other wedge issues as well, and faith issues that shouldn't be faith issues that Christians raise it to be within Christianity as well. So different belief systems to, is it a flat earth or is it a globe earth? Like, why does that get raised to like a
Right.
faith issue? And it's so contentious. And I'm agnostic on that, but it ought not to be, whichever side you're on,
Yeah,
to be
absolutely.
a faith issue. And if it's part of the great delusion of the end time, it's only part of it. It's not all of it. So we should be careful with those kinds of things. And it's okay to agree to disagree.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
It's heartbreaking seeing brothers and sisters break fellowship over that type of stuff. And you're right. I have seen that, especially, was it a flat earth or a geocentric earth?
Yeah.
Those break, like I said, they break fellowship with people, and you get to where you're falsely accusing your brother and of not believing the Bible.
Yeah. And what I try and sort of convince people is I'm not trying to convert you to agreeing with everything I say. I'm presenting my research, and if there's pieces of it that you can use it as much as you like. But if what I'm really trying to do by presenting the research is to try and answer questions for people, and take away the confusion and take away the conflicts. The problem, like with end time prophecy, is when they get locked into these preconceived chronologies and events, they have to leave out inconvenient passages. And then the other thing they have to do is they have to reinvent what it says in the Bible. In fact, you got to pretty much, in a lot of the approaches, turn scripture into a pretzel. And I think a master pretzel maker would be impressed with how they bend the truth at times.
Yeah.
So, and I would urge people, if that's what you have to do, something's wrong. That's a red flag. If they basically, and I know they don't come across and say it this way, but it's how I understand it, is like, you can't believe your lying eyes, what you're reading. That's an issue. And if they are saying things like, well, we don't have to include everything.
Right.
I don't have to make that fit. And I'm fine. You can believe in whatever chronology you want. Just say, I haven't fit that piece in yet. And I'm fine with that. I get that.
That's intellectual honesty.
Yeah, it's intellectual honesty, and they're still wedded to working that out. And not everybody has worked everything out. Everybody's at a different level in terms of their spiritual sort of quest, so to speak, in terms of learning the Bible and trying to put the pieces together. So we ought not to be judgmental on our learning curve.
And, I couldn't have said it better. And that leaves too much wiggle room for the devil to come in and bring contention and deceit,
Oh, and they jump all over it.
Absolutely.
And the polytheists jump all over it. In fact, polytheists know the Bible better than Christians do.
Unfortunately.
Particularly with the Gnostics and the secret societies. And they seize on specific passages that just drive Christians crazy, because they know the Christian hasn't, for the most part, read enough or know enough, and they know they've just seeded doubt, and that's what they're there to do. And you also know there's a trickery way, and they've been well versed in specific passages. They've been well versed in tactics. So what they tend to do, and again, watch out for this, particularly when it gets into the prophecy side, it might help you sort of see through that maybe the person isn't a prophecy expert, he's a disinformation expert. And so what they
Joseph
tend to do, what they tend to do is they say, well, what about this passage, right? So you answer that passage. Then they say, okay, well, what about this? And then what about that? And I call that their tactic and their rhetoric and how they handle debate is chase the rabbit argument. They never deal with something you've dealt with. They just keep, because they have this incredibly long list of these things that they can keep throwing out that they've been provided, and they're just wanting to get you to go to a point where you can't answer something. And when you can't, they've got you. It's a process to the got you question. And so what I do is I'll answer one, and then I'll evaluate, is this going to be a discussion or is this going to be a chase the rabbit argument? And if they show their tip their hand as the chase the rabbit, I'll say, okay, I'll play chase the rabbit. I actually call it that, and they hate it. And then I say along with it, but I'm only going to play for so long unless you start dealing with what I've argued. Take on the argument. And if they can, and if they don't, then I just say, okay, this is the last time. I'll give you one more. What's your best shot? Is typically what I like to do. And they'll give me their best shot, and I'll answer that, and I'll say, okay, we're done.
I would sincerely hate to be a polytheist and debate you. I mean, I'm just thinking about that. That would not be a good day.
Well, I have to admit, I got roughed up a few times early on because I wasn't ready for the skill level that they had. So you have to prepare yourself because they're in a very serious game. They believe they are anyways. And it is a serious game. There's no doubt about it. But it's not a game. It's about, are you going to be resurrected or not?
It's very, very serious.
And they don't want us being resurrected, and they don't want to consider that that's a possibility. The people who are trying to deceive us, and they believe that they're going to win. The angels that they believe in know that they can't win, but their followers don't. So they're very well prepared. Understand that they go out in the world to do these things, and they're on social media, on Christian sites all the time, and they're way more active than what people think, and they know the Bible well enough they can disguise themselves as a Christian.
That's the part that gets me. Just as you said, you can go on Christian sites and blogs and kind of Facebook pages, and it's very, very hard to tell. But if you really look at the intricate nature and how they engage people, it's very disingenuous. It's not like brothers actually having a discussion about, biblical prophecy or eschatology or just fellowshipping in the word. It's very, very pointed. And somebody would need to have a little bit of discernment to actually find them out. You're right. They're dangerous in a lot of ways.
Yep. But once you learn that, then you're not going to get sucked in to it. I find it a bit entertaining, but I'm not going to play the game forever. So I just, you've had enough till you can actually start answering these list of things that I've said.
Instead of trying to muddy the waters with,
we're not having a discussion, and then they might come back and they'll say, "Oh, well, I thought this was a good teaching site," and I come back. The types of questions you're asking, they aren't looking for being taught. You're looking to deceive.
Yeah, no doubt. So, what would you advise somebody who isn't very well versed in the Bible, and because that's the people they look for, the new Christians or people that aren't really in their Bible? Those folks shouldn't probably engage in those type of conversations publicly, right?
No, they shouldn't, because you're set up to lose.
Yeah,
you're like the sheep for the slaughter for them, and they're looking for the weak ones.
And it's wild how they try to put it on public display. They can have their aha moment.
Yeah. Now, I would advise Christians that if you're going to get into debates in social media, you should do your homework first. And then come back and participate, and then understand you're going to get beat up because you haven't learned enough yet. But look at that as saying, I need to go back. I need to be smarter on these things. Haven't heard that argument. What's going on with that? Now, how do I resolve that? But you have to, it's a process to get to a level where you get comfortable that you should be able to, even if they're using a passage you haven't really looked at that closely, because we all know there's a lot of passages in the Bible.
Yes, there are.
You should be able to go and look at that verse, look at the couple passages around it, understand the context, and then be able to answer the questions and bring up other passages that would relate to it. You need to be at the level where you can connect at least relevant passages to most ideas in the Bible. So that means a fair bit of skill, but you can add to that skill level through the learning process. But don't get into the deep end until you're ready to be in the deep end.
Amen. I agree wholeheartedly, and just recognize that it's all intentional. You know,
Yeah.
they come as a casual brother or sister in the faith wanting to have a conversation. Then
Yeah.
it takes that 90-degree turn. You know.
Yeah.
So it's very, very good, wise counsel, Mr. Wayne.
Yeah, and also understand that, if it is a Gnostic, which is like a lot of the deceivers that are on, there's many ones that are out there in different groups, but if they understand you've recognized them as a Gnostic and you said, hey, look, I know you're polytheist, I know you're a Gnostic, that's okay. We can have a discussion, but let's just keep it above board. They're fine with that.
Really?
Yeah.
So if you kind of like bust them, like say, hey, you don't have to pretend to be a Christian. I know exactly what you are.
Yep. Just go out there
Wow.
and say, hey, look, you're talking like a Gnostic or a secret society member, probably not a depth level or a depth level. So let's just get that on the table so we can have a better conversation.
Yeah, let's be honest. Let's, good faith conversation.
Yeah.
That's
they'll
awesome.
kind of go laugh out loud and they'll chuckle and say, okay.
You got me.
Yeah.
Wow. That's awesome. Gary Wayne called him out.
So I've had a few, and I'm hoping, I'm back on social media a little bit more, but I used to spend a lot of time on it before I got into the second book. So I kind of miss it. It kind of keeps you sharp, and but I always try and keep it above board and respectful.
Absolutely.
It's easy to let your emotions get away, and I can keep my emotions a little bit better under control when I'm typing when I'm actually in a passionate debate. So
right.
when I'm speaking. So
and that, and I think that's another part of their nefarious plan is to push us into a position where they get where we get emotional. Yeah. Then they can say, aha, see, I thought you believed in the truth. So why are you getting emotional?
Yeah, and you're insecure because you're getting upset.
Exactly.
Now,
I've had that a couple of times.
And what I also try, but when I am talking with people face to face, I will remind them there's a difference between my passion and when I'm upset, and you will clearly know the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone who's ever heard you speak knows that you're passionate about the Word of God.
Yeah.
And then again, anybody who's ever heard you speak wouldn't like actually try to challenge you on biblical knowledge either.
Well, some are pretty good with their questions because they're well versed. Others are, as I say, they just do accusations. So,
right.
I mean, how do you deal with a baseless accusation? Well, probably you shouldn't.
No, not at all. And not dealing facts. When they start swaying over to being accusatory and stuff like that, then it's a bad faith conversation.
Yep.
So I was going to ask you a few questions tonight about some of these biblical monsters. The bulls of Bashan and the cows of Bashan.
Yeah.
Were these like super, the Bible talks about how they had extraordinary strength. Mm-hmm. And I've heard people say it's because there was a certain type of grass that grew in Bashan, and then you know what I mean? So like
a special kind of spinach like Popeye had.
Exactly, yeah. And then the cows would eat that, and then the warriors would eat the cows, and they'd be yoked up, big and strong. So what's your thoughts on that, like the bulls of Bashan and the cows of Bashan? Because they were specifically called that as the male and the females in that tribe.
I particularly like the imagination for the grass. That's I've not heard that before. That's I have to give somebody credit for trying to rationalize what that's all about. So it's a term of the world that most Christians don't understand. And but when you start to understand that we live in the Gentile Sea, we swim in it. It's all around us. It's like the Matrix. It's everywhere. This is part of their language, and the Bible has provided us an accounting with the region of Bashan that's at Mount Hermon, and the bulls, and relating the bulls to Bashan. And it's to help us to understand if we let it. So these are the bulls of Bashan that's talked about in the book of Psalms that are mocking Jesus on the cross in the prophecy. So we can imagine they were there taunting him when he was actually crucified. So these are beings. These aren't strong bulls or somebody who ate well-fed, grass-fed bulls. I suppose some of them could have been doing, but that's not who they're talking about. So one of the things that we kind of need to understand is the language of the polytheists. And so bulls is a significant part of their language and imagery. And we've heard of the bull cult.
Right.
We've heard of like Molech and Baal being kind of depicted as a bull. But yet no Christian seems to want to say, well, that's kind of odd. And are they connected to these bulls of Bashan? Well, Bashan is at Mount Hermon. And Baal is the chief god of the Baalim, who has their Baalim council at Mount Hermon. The council of the gods in Psalms 82 that rules over the 70 nations talked about in Deuteronomy 32, both before and after the flood, a different council of those gods, because many of them, well, the parent gods went to the pit prison, and then the offspring gods like Baal went to the pit prison as well for the same crimes. So this is a relationship to fallen angels and their offspring. So I'll come back to Baal of the covenant land once I give a parallel example that people might be able to understand, and from a sort of a well-known story or history or mythology.
Sure.
And also understand a bull is a male god, and the cow is representative of the mother goddess, right? Makes sense? Male, female. We just, yeah. So if we understand it sort of that way, so like Hathor in Egypt, for example, is depicted a lot of times as a cow as well, right? In that cult. So understand that. So what I'm going to talk about, which is really enlightening here, as a parallel to the one that really double taps it, so to speak, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. Right? With the Gilgamesh giant. Well, who is he the offspring of? He's the offspring of the mother goddess, Nin or Ninsen, depending on which translation that you're reading from, and Lugobanda, a male, king of Uruk. So either already a giant or is a human. But he's, these giants in the Epic of Gilgamesh are 2/3 god and 1/3 human. So there may be raising of that stock level to more god than, let's say, human, because you've got a giant who's, let's say, a demigod, and now marrying a mother goddess to maybe give a higher content in the description there as 1/3 human, 2/3 god. Don't know, just my speculation. But what's important is this is a goddess that's understood as a bull. And the gods in the Sumerian pantheons were also described as strong as bulls. They're understood as bulls. It's part of the imagery of them. And Gilgamesh, as Enkidu, who's created in the same way, is like a wild bull. He is a wild bull. He's hairy, and he's a tyrant. And so he's a bull. So understand this is a constant that goes throughout the polytheist world, that gods are called bulls, whether male or female, and so are their offspring. So let's go to the Ugaritic text now, where the Baalim Council are talked about, ruling from Mount Saphon, which is another name for Mount Hermon. In fact, Hermon is a more recent name. It's rooted in the Hebrew word haram, Charam and em, meaning a curse or accursed, for the curse of anathema that was taken there by the 200 watchers who are going to create let's call them bull offspring giants. And so the original name had several names in the Bible that we're told. So Saphon is one that comes out of the Ugaritic text. And Ugarit, if people don't know where that's located, it's located halfway between Mount Hermon and Tyr in the north part of the Covenant land. Okay, so not very far from Mount Hermon, and
At all, yeah.
and in the mountains of Lebanon. So some other names that Mount Hermon is talked about in the Old Testament is Sirion, Sinir, and Sion, Sion, as it's called in Deuteronomy 4 and the last couple of chapters of that. And it actually says Mount Hermon is Mount Sion there. So I'm not illegitimately connecting information here. So its name was changed. So Saphon is just another transliteration of the original name. Hebrew would be Sion, but not spelt like Zion. It's a completely different Hebrew word, and different from the Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Very important to denote, because the polytheists conflate that for obvious reasons with Mount Hermon.
Right. It would behoove them to do so.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's so unlike them to be so deceptive. And so the gods of the Baalim council in the Ugaritic text, and Baalim is the male plural for Baal. So there's other gods there like Karet, which Crete takes its name from, and where Zeus spent a lot of time. You have Amor, you have, I won't go through all the different gods that are listed there, but we get them as the Baalim multiple for these gods that are ruling from the Baalim council at Mount Hermon. And they're all called bulls. Wow. And then they produce offspring. And this is the Rapium, or the Rapiu as it's transliterated in RPM in the original Semitic language out of the Ugarit, which is very similar to the original Hebrew language that was vowelless. So RPM is the same spelling as you would do for Nephilim, which would be NPL. Okay, so Nephilim is some of the terms you might be, if you're doing a lot of reading on giants, they'll use, well, they're not Nephilim, they're Nephilim. The H is part of the evolution of the language in Hebrew to add it on, as in the Raphaim with the PH and the F sound, as opposed to Rapium, which it may have been originally, or Rapiam. It might have been a combination of sounds, and they added the H just as the vowels were added downstream as well. So these are the giants that we have in the Bible, the Raphaim.
Right.
Created by Baal and Anat after the flood, and other Baalim councils. For example, Amur or Amuru creates a giant in the Ugaritic text of one of the members of the assembly of the Datanu, the assembly of the giants, that's also at Mount Hermon, that answers to the council of gods. And these are the kings of the dynastic rulers. Has an offspring named Amur, which is going to be the patriarchal root for the Amorites who don't have a patriarch, Amori.
That's something you taught us on the last show too, that these giants followed the female instead of, the 70 nations or whatever, how they followed the male lineage. It's going through the female giant tests or whatever. Yeah,
well, the bloodline goes through the female, and the new dynasties are started by pure blood females because they're so rare. So
wow.
So the offspring of the giants are called bulls in the Ugaritic text. Now, when we look up the definition for Nephilim, it can mean a giant, a tribe of giants, a tyrant, or a bully. It's not that they were just bullies. They were bull-like, like they do things of the bulls, right? And they are tyrants. So it's just another larger description for the giant name. And people will use that and seize on that to say, well, it doesn't mean a giant. That's the proper application. And just as tyrant goes back to Tyrannos of the Gyges kings, that were part of the Herculides bloodline of
Wow.
kings that were in Assyria, that were in Anatolia, that were in Crete, that were in other parts of Greece. And that's the bloodline of Hercules, son of Zeus and Alcmene. And that is the Creta that's the Cretagens in their bloodline system. And it's called Cretagens because Zeus spent a lot of time on Crete, and it's connected to Zeus and Crete and the creation of Hercules and the
Wow.
bloodline, right? So everything starts to make some sense. So the offspring are called bulls. And if you look at, Gibborim, they're described as bullies as well as and as tyrants, because a lot of times Gibborim describes a giant. So
Right.
you start to see the significance here. So demons are the disembodied spirits of these bullies, of the giants. And so they're part of it. So you've got fallen angelic bulls, and then you've got the demigod bulls in spirit form who are mocking Jesus on the cross. And it's very clear that they don't know what they're doing at this point in time, because if we look at First Corinthians, it says if the archons, if the princes of this world knew
Archons. Yeah.
about the resurrection, they wouldn't have had Jesus crucified. And they're on the cross and they're mocking him like they think they've defeated him. These are the bulls of Bashan. Now, prophetically, these fatlings of Bashan, these bulls of Bashan, have two dates with destiny in the end time for a great slaughter. You have the Ezekiel 38 and 39 war of these fatlings of Bashan, as it talks about in Ezekiel 39 of that war and the great slaughter of the Gog war. That's Joel 1 and 2 and Revelation 9 war that happens just before the midpoint of the last 7 years. And interestingly enough, we have this war happening immediately after the pit prison is opened, and you have Gog of Magog, chief prince of Meshech, that's leading this alliance in Ezekiel 38 that we know is an end time war, because in Ezekiel 38 it says it's a war of the last days. So it could be any time in the last 7 years. Some people think it's Armageddon, but it's not. And how do we know that? Because Ezekiel 39, after the slaughter of the bulls of Bashan on a mountain close to Mount Hermon, you have second Exodus, which happens in the last 3.5 years, which we talked about a few minutes ago in part of that reconciliation. So this is an end time war before the midpoint, and expect that Antichrist will use this war to assert part of his claim to be the Messiah, and that's an Armageddon war, because it has 200 million man army in it, and 33% of the population is destroyed in the earth. It will seem Armageddon-like, but he needs that to come to power. So the bulls of Bashan are being slaughtered there. And who else do we see show up in Joel 1 and 2 and in Ezekiel 39? The mighty ones that are being slaughtered there. And then you have these travelers or passengers. That goes back to a Hebrew word that means to cross over.
Wow.
And so you have this intermix of these demons and these mighty men, mighty ones in the description of the royales that are being slaughtered there in this end time war. So it's a very important term to understand the bulls of Bashan, not only as it now links into the Gog war, Joel 1 and 2, Revelation 9, but then Armageddon, Revelation 16 and 19, and in Joel 3, that there's another great slaughter that happens when Jesus comes, on the day of Armageddon. So it's important that we understand these terms, and that these are historical terms, and we're not done with them yet.
Amen. That's awesome. That's a whole lot more interesting than some special grass being grown And the
That was a
fatted
good story,
cows.
especially when I
Yeah.
said, "Oh, maybe that's how they got Popeye created." Was
Yeah, right. They eat this grass, and then the cows become huge, and the warriors
yeah,
become huge from eating the cows. Yeah, I like the biblical account a little bit better.
yeah, yeah. It
So
really brings it really brings the Old Testament and prophecy to life when you
absolutely,
understand the terms.
for sure. And another one I was going to ask you about. You just said it, the mighty man. Now, people say there's a lot of connotations for that.
Hmm.
Samson was a mighty man of God.
Yeah,
And then you have the Genesis 6. These were the mighty men of old, men of renown. So these mighty men are what we would call demigods.
yeah. So again, what be careful of the people who are very clever. They'll say, "Well, how could these be Nephilim giants if it says they're mighty men?" And like
Right.
that's not possible because this is supposed to be the giant. Well, they're the offspring of fallen angels and humans. So
Yeah.
they're going to be part human and at least 50% human. So they are a hybrid being. They're not angelic, and they're probably more closely connected because they're physical beings as opposed to spiritual beings at this point, um, to men. So they're a kind of hybrid human, right?
Right.
And so a superhuman, an uberhuman, an overon who Oberon human, as Oberon is the king of the fairies in Shakespeare. It's the same word as Uber in the Indo-Aryan Uber as well, where that comes from.
Oh,
And
wow.
overlord and overreign and overon in different transliterations is the same word, just in different languages. So it's a description of these types of individuals. So again, I think it's kind of important that we understand that when they talk about mighty men, don't just automatically dismiss that they're talking about giants. On the other hand, don't automatically say it's a giant.
Right.
So, for example, Nimrod became a mighty one, and that's Gibor, Gibborim in the plural, as we might understand it. But he's not Nephilim or Rephaim. He's not described as that, and we have a human father. So somehow, some way, he becomes like a Superman. And I say that tongue in cheek because people may not be familiar with the Hebrew word that is used for began, and that's Kal-El.
Right. I
And
just
that,
heard that the other day. It floored me.
yeah. And of course, his father is Dural, right?
Right.
And he's from the house of El. Well, who is the parent of Baal? El.
Ah,
And Al, which means Lord God in some of the translations, or Master God, Al is a transliteration of El in Baal. So we need to understand where they take these superhero terms from and how they base the superheroes on, just as these were the heroes of old. That is used in, let's say, the NIV translation instead of mighty ones. These were the heroes of old, and the heroes of Uruk were like Gilgamesh and those giant guys that had these heroic stories, or the heroes of Greek history, like Hercules that we just talked about, or Achilles, who was 12 feet tall, or on and on and on with all the different giants. I won't go through all the giant names listed, but just you get the idea. I could probably for a long
yeah,
time,
probably. I know you could, but
let's not soothe my ego. Let's stay on topic.
I find all this stuff ridiculously
Yeah.
interesting. So you wouldn't be
Yeah.
hurting my feelings at all.
So again, so whatever happens to Nimrod, he's not technically a Rephaim or a Nephilim or a Gershim or an Avim or a Cherithim or an Anakim, some of the other names for giants, and there's many more in the Old Testament. But he's giant-like. He at least acts like a giant or becomes mighty like a giant somehow, some way. Won't go. That's another rabbit hole. I want to stay on the word Gibor. which can mean a description of a giant, as it's used in the classic example of Genesis 6:4, where it's describing the Nephilim. And so, but Gibor is translated as giant in Joshua 16. I think 14 is the passage. And I'll let people decide whether or not that should be translated as giant or just a mighty warrior or a human that was kind of mighty, kind of like part of David's men, right? Not all of
right.
David's men. They're mighty ones, the mighty men of David. That's the Hebrew word Gibor, Giborim there.
Right.
But they're Israelites. They're not giants. Now, there's a couple suspects in there you could connect into types of giants,
Yeah,
like
there's a couple of suspects.
yeah, like Uriah the Hittite, who's from a hybrid Canaanite and Rephaim race, and you have a Maaccatheme from Makkah in the Mount Hermon region. Then in book 2, I'll show you how we know Maaccatheme and the house of Makkah is a tribe of giants. Just like the Gesherim are, and they live up in the same region in Mount Hermon. And so not always is the word Gabor or mighty one used for a giant. So I have to be careful. It's used 155 to 158 times in the Old Testament. And it can mean just a noble man. It can just mean strength. It can mean a few other things. So we have to be careful every time it says mighty man or mighty one, that it's not necessarily describing a giant. You have to have more context to it to make that case.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So I think when we look at what's being talked about in Genesis 6:4, and the application of the as men there, I mean, it's pretty clear. These are the offspring of angels, sons of God. And we can go through all the sons of God, how we know those are in the Old Testament angels. Best one is Psalms 82. It's similar term. It's the sons of the God Most High, which are the council of the gods, and the mighty El that rule in there. Again, El is the Hebrew word not only for God Most High in the singular uppercase superlative sense and Elohim, but also for an angel or a god. So you also have Job 38:4-7, which is done just after the physical universe is created, where the morning stars and the sons of God are celebrating. Humans weren't there then. So
right.
So all the applications are used interchangeably in the Old Testament for angels, and angels will be used with host of heaven. Stars is another allegory. So you have stars, sons of God, host of heaven, and angels, and they're used together in multiple passages to show you they're all the same beings. And just as it's those angels that are sons of God presenting themselves in Job 2:1 and 1:6, right? It just starts to make sense. And Deuteronomy 32, where it says the sons of Israel, when we're talking about the 70 nations, both before and after the flood, understand that's a compound word there. And the compound word for Israel, even though most people say wrestles with God because that's why Jacob received the name Israel, it's a title. And this is used in what I call a dual prophecy. But what is the dual prophecy? I explain it in detail, show lots of examples in book 2, but quick and dirty, it has important information on prehistory to understand what's going on in the Bible. It has events prophesied for the time of the prophet, in this case, Moses. And there are some unfulfilled prophecies for the end time. And in this case, the part that reflects Israel as the sons of Israel and the 70 sons that are born to Israel in Exodus 1:5 as the number confirmed by the patriarchs in Genesis 10. And by inference, Adam had 70 sons before the flood, even though they're not listed, but it's the same number as you understand the context of Deuteronomy 32:8-10. So the compounded word for Israel that Jacob changes his name to, and the tribes of Israel will be the patriarchs for the nations going into the millennium. That's where it gets fulfilled. So it's not incorrectly translated as Israel, it's incorrectly understood. Now, in other translations, I would say the same thing, and I'm not contradicting myself here, so bear with me on as I tell the story. So if you go to the Septuagint, it's going to say the sons of God or angels. I can't remember which. It's going to say angels there, and that's not incorrect either. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, in the Aramaic version, it's going to say the sons of God. And again, that's not wrong either. They're all correct. But we understand Israel there as the tribe of Israel, which is only partly the case for the future fulfillment of the prophecy that and answers why Jacob had his name changed to that, right? It's all part of the great plan. So compounded word makes up Israel. First word is Sarah, Tsarah in the Hebrew. And it means either a prince, just as angels are called princes, and also a ruler, just as angels are called rulers and judges and other terms and understandings. And El is, of course, God.
Right.
Could mean, but in this case, it's going to be in the singular superlative sense of El Elyon. So now you have the sons of Israel, which actually should be translated as the sons of the ruling God. And that's the title that Israel inherits. And they're going to be called the children of God, as it's talked about in Isaiah and Hosea in the second Exodus prophecies after the reconciliation, which is where that title takes effect for the millennium. It's absolutely in perfection.
Huh. That's phenomenal though. Like Jesus been Joseph, you know, it makes sense. It's real. So.
Yeah. So people say, well, geez, Israel has an etymological root to Ra and El, coming out of Egypt. I'm going, yep, you could get that in the English. You can't get that through the Hebrew, but you could get there. And Ra actually means evil in Hebrew. But if you understand they're two separate words that have come together, you get no etymological link back to the Egyptian language. So, and a lot of the things that people will say, well, that's an Egyptian word, has no link back to an Egyptian word, or that's like hallelujah is a connection back to the Sumerian pantheon. There is none.
Yeah, I've heard that before.
Yeah, when you take it back to the original Hebrew and the compounded words that make them up, there's no connection. What?
Amen. It's supposed to be Amun Ra or something like that.
Yeah.
Which is lunacy.
It's well, I can see how they get there. If you're looking for how do you sort of get everybody worshiping the pantheon, have them right say the chief god's name every time. Yeah, I get that, but that's the deceivers putting misinformation into Christianity to seed doubt.
Right. Another old flim flam by the enemy.
Yep.
So we've cleared up the mighty ones. We've cleared up the bulls and cows of Bashan. Speaking of King David, he was talking about his mighty men. Now, there are some suspects in David's mighty men, like how one could take out 30 with his staff, and so David's mighty men, the lion men of Moab.
Mm-hmm.
So these characters, they seem to have some superhuman qualities to them.
Well, and they're called mighty ones.
Right.
So again, my advice to people is when you see that word, and that's Gabur there, for the application for them and in the application for the wild men of the Gadites, the lion-like Gadites, right?
Right.
And when you take those words back to Hebrew, it's Ari and Ariel. And so that's very close to Aryan.
Yeah.
But that's a different sort of train of thought. But understand, like, even if it's Ariel, it would be, as an angel's name, which some people will say is part of the rebellious angels, that would mean lion of God, or God's lion. But everything in there is to do with lions. And so these are beings that look like lions. And we have one king in Genesis 14. So these aren't just totally isolated. We have a king in the War of Giants called Arioch.
Right.
Notice the word Ari and Och on there, and it means lion-like. Did you take that back to the Hebrew? And this is coming out of Mesopotamia. And one of the chief gods that was worshipped was Nergal, which was the war god, and he was depicted with a lion's head.
Wow.
So if he had offspring, he would produce giants that looked like him.
Right.
And you get these lion-like men, and there's different kinds. Some have bodies of humans and heads of lions, and some have um, heads of humans and bodies of lions. And so there might be a couple different kinds of mix, although the ones that have bodies of lions and human heads, that seems to be more before the flood. So the Irmalu would be one of those ones in the Sumerian thing. And then these other ones are more like what we understand, a human with a lion's head, but a very significant warrior, and seemingly connected back to an angel named Ariel, right? Lion-like, or Lion of God. And so we also have these depictions of these lion men in Egypt. And of course, we have lion gods and goddesses there, like you have Sekhmet or Mahis and others, and they produced offspring as well in the Egyptian. So you have reliefs that show these types of lion beings. So there seems to be a connection to their warrior status to the Nephilim and the Rephaim and the other giants, but they're distinct. So from a different type of watcher, let's say. So where most of the giants might come from the seraphim, as I talk about in book 1, and most of them are red-haired and blonde hair and hazel eyes and blue eyes and pale skins, we have another watcher that when it's taking a physical form, it takes a different form 4 different ways depending on its choice, because it has 4 different faces, and that's a cherubim. And it has a face of a human, and and typically those are dark-haired humans, face or in the depiction, a dark-haired human head. You have a lion's head, you have an eagle or a bird's head, and you have a bull's head.
Right.
Okay, so now if you look at a sphinx in Egypt, as it's worshipped in a lion motif, it's either going to be depicted as a human head or a lion's head. I won't argue which one that one is, but you could be both or either, and you could have similar ones elsewhere. As you move into the Middle East, you have more of the Carib version and the CH used to be a K sound at one time, so it would be more understood as a Carib. And you have these Caribs that guarded palaces and the temples and the gates to the other world, to Hades or Sheol, and they're going to have a bull's head, or they're going to have this gargoyle type bird head, right? So a gargoyle would be more of a bird type of cherubim as it's being depicted. So if the one with the dark hair produced offspring, you would have a dark-haired giant. And what do you know with gods like Gilgamesh? I mean, demigods like Gilgamesh. And Nin is a bull. And bull or ox is one of the faces, right? So all of a sudden now you're going to count for these dark-haired giants with these dark-haired beards as Gilgamesh, Nimrod, and also the Anunnaki watchers are depicted in some reliefs. They have these wings, these stocky legs. They're doing this ceremony around this piece of technology. Some people call it tree of life. They got these funny looking purses that probably have technology in it. They got a pine cone or a crystal or something in their hand when they're doing some sort of ritual. Well, you can also see that identical depiction, this time with a bird head for the Anunnaki, which again is that other head on the cherubim. So you could have other kinds of giants being created from another watcher, and Gilgamesh is different in those, and these dark-haired giants that are also showing up in with Syrian kings and the Aramaean dynasties. They have more of a dark hair and bushy beards as they're depicted than the blonde hair and the red hair ones. So there seems to be a different kind, and Gilgamesh is taller than the giants in the Bible. He is like 11 cubits tall, and he is 4 cubits wide, and he's the king of Uruk. So measure him on a 21-inch cubit, he's 19 feet tall, and he's 7 feet wide. So he's significantly bigger than Og, which would be likely the biggest one that we would have, because Og would be fitting inside a 9-cubit long bed and a 4-cubit wide. So he's going to be 12 to 14 or 15 feet tall to 4 to 5 or 6 feet wide to fit into the iron bed. And just as Achilles was, and most Greek giants were in that 12-foot range, and Goliath at 6 cubits and a span would be 11 feet 3 inches. So a little bit further downstream, slightly smaller, but not a whole bunch smaller. And then you have Orontes, which is another eastern giant that was buried in just north of the Covenant land, and the river Orontes is named after him. And I think it was Pausanias who talked about this discovery of this giant in that time, and he is 11 cubits tall based on the bone. So he's the same size as Gilgamesh is, according to that historian. Yeah. So you can have these different kinds of giants like the lion men. Now here's one that's going to blow your mind. Maybe not from what I just said, but might be a little bit more predictable than maybe normal, but it's still mind-blowing. So we have this other mythos of a dog warriors that I call dog Nephilim. And so in Egypt, you have Anubis, that's a jackal god. And he produces offspring, and he produces a lot of offspring, and they look like him. They are like dog-headed giants. And so much so, Anubis created a city for him, and he called it Sinoopolis in the Greek. Cynocephalus is the name for the dog mythos. So this is dog city as you translate that. Polis is Greek for city, so Sinoopolis. And so these seem to be warriors and giants, but again, lower than the seraphim ones who are in charge of the governance, right? And the religions, more just as warrior class. So a little bit inferior some way, somehow, maybe to do with the pantheon. Not real sure, but they just seem to be a little bit lower level. So much so that Goliath, when he's talking to David, who is approaching him as this kid barely out of puberty with a slingshot, Goliath is saying, you're insulting me. Like, what am I, a dog? Like a lower level warrior?
Oh, okay. So we weren't necessarily talking about some dog that's going to be looking up from pawns.
He's talking from his own cultural understanding, right?
That did blow my mind, Gary Wayne, by the way.
So, but can we biblically make that work? Well, possibly. There's just as Nergal shows up in the Bible in 2 Corinthians 7 or 2 Kings 17. You also have a god named Nebaz. The Avim worship all of these gods, and there's Eastern Avim giants, not just in the southern part of the Covenant land. And so this name Nebaz, as you take it back to Hebrew, means a barking god. And he was depicted, as it says with the definition, with the body of a human and a head of a dog.
Cynocephaly.
Yeah, so this is a dog god, a jackal god, part of the angelic pantheon, both loyal and disloyal. So once you sort of understand that, because they can take a physical body, which means they create a soul and a body for their spirit, because they're spirit beings. That's called an oiketerion, or a dwelling place for the spirit. That means they're going to have now DNA that was created to let them interact in the physical world and to do things in the physical world, like eat, drink, and do other sorts of things, including having sex. So now they have the ability to pass on their DNA. And the giants are going to look a lot like them. So when we look at the original giants for seraphim, which are serpent-faced angels before the flood, they're basically described in all of the writings as serpents and dragons, just as their parents were, just as the pantheons were, just as Anu was a serpent god, just as his offspring god rulers after Enki and Enlil were serpent gods. And so serpents were described as Uraeus gods for the Egyptian gods like Osiris and the other gods that went with that pantheon. Feathered serpents, plumed serpents, as
So
in
I was just thinking of like a cool Khan.
Yeah, they're all the same order of angels, only rebellious angels, and the dragon creator gods in China, and the Naga gods in the subcontinent of India. It's a worldwide standard, and why most of the pantheon is serpentine. So the kings were called serpents, and you get these pre-flood depictions of the giants throughout the Middle East in the serpentine look. Well, even first giants, again, for the most part, except for from a different watcher, would have that serpentine look after the flood. So, but they have a different issue after the flood, I think, as we might have talked in the first couple of shows, where they're going to have a fertility issue, and I think manifests in lack of females, and they're going to have to interbreed with humans lest they go extinct. And so they're going to have a dilution that goes on. But we can look at a Rephaim king who is part of the terrible ones and the bloodlines of terrible ones, just as the Egyptian king, Pharaoh, described in Ezekiel, and specifically Ezekiel 32 and 31, but 32 is the better one to read first. He is a Pharaoh that's talking to his brethren, the terrible ones, who are in the pit prison after they were slain. And he's also talking to the mighty, which is El, and the mighty ones that are in the sides of the abyss that he's talking to that are his brethren are Gibor or Gibborim, and the angels are El, as in mighty. They're both there. One's in the center and one's in the sides of the pit prison. And so that's who he's talking to. And now if you sort of bring that understanding in to this cobra-like headdress that they would wear, which would widen their neck out to give you the better size of the long, thick neck that these giants had. Now bring up a King Pharaoh Akhenaten statue on the internet, if people want to do that at home. And you're going to see a serpentine face. You're going to have this elongated skull. If you don't see that, you're going to see this elongated hat to cover this elongated skull. That's monstrous. It's going to have an extended chin that comes out. It's going to have very high cheekbones. Going to have large wraparound eyes, and keep in mind that those eyes would glow and light up a room. You're going to see that cobra headdress that he would wear, and you're going to have thin sort of serpentine, thin lips that gives you more of that sort of serpentine look. But you look at that, that's not a human's face. That's a hybrid looking face. And this is after dilution over 1,000 years after the flood.
Yeah, this is a real strange looking character.
Yeah. And if you look at him from the side, it is very serpentine in the look. There you go.
Yeah. Very, very much.
So I think there's a strong case for this DNA being passed on, and the giants look after their would appear like their celestial mafia godfathers or godmothers.
Yeah, and that's on the first couple of shows. That's something you kind of skim the surface of, so to speak. You were talking about how that's why they would put such an emphasis on the bloodlines and
Yeah.
preserving them, which makes
Preserving them
all
to
the
keep
sense in the world.
yeah, keep that bloodline pure, because they're given the divine right to rule by a specific celestial mafia godfather at the Council of the Gods. And so to keep their superiority and that divine right to rule, they want to keep that bloodline pure so that they can make a justification for their divine right to rule and their claim to be the elite. Well,
Huh.
that's an interesting term, isn't it?
Very much
Elite.
so.
Yeah.
El
And
eat.
yeah, Elite. It might as well be Elim. It would have been a better, but
Oh,
they went with the ite, which is again a term that's used, biblically for people. So, but it should have been Elim, and the definition of elite goes to a superior nature of people who have, through not only privilege and education but genealogy,
mm,
have the right to rule over the world. So everything shows up in their names and their titles if we understand that they create the languages too.
right. That's spooky. That's what these elites, just like as you say, the godmother and godfathers of this, little G
Yeah.
gangsters, the little G god gangsters back in the day. They believe that they have some sort of a blood right rule over
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, they do. It's crazy. So
It really is. And let me ask you this, Mr. Gary Wayne. Do you think these people actually do, or what's a better way to say that? Do you think that some of these elites actually are the bloodlines of these giants? Or do they believe they are?
yeah, so I can't definitely 100% say they are, but they believe they are, and
Right.
they have the genealogies, they say, to back that up.
Wow.
So whether it's true or not, or whether or not I believe it or not, or you believe it or not, it's not really the point. It's it's that they believe it, and more importantly, is what they do with that belief system. But
Mm,
I do know they keep their genealogies, and I do know they all have their own coats of arms that reflect their
right.
genealogy. And if you notice on some of those coats of arms, what do you see showing up on them? Eagles,
Eagles
lions,
and dragons, lions,
dragons, bulls, everything that you can
strange looking
imagine.
lions.
Yeah,
Yes.
these are taciturn symbols back to their celestial mafia godfathers that they trace their genealogies back to specific giants and to specific fallen angels. So King
Wow.
Charles III, who swore his oath probably to one specific god of the Baalim, not to the God of the Bible, in his ancient rite of inheritance ritual that everybody got to see, that goes right back to begin to the time of the flood and then before. And he is on record when he was Prince Charles as saying, "I'm a descendant of Vlad the Impaler."
Yes.
And people can Google that, and I can send people the links if they want to. But understand that he said that. How he gets there is the Windsors had their name changed in World War II from Hanover because they were the Germans, and Middle Europa bloodline. And all throughout Middle Europa, you'd have a lot of intermarriage, but you would still have intermarriage even if they weren't that close. Because if you look at World War I, that was a war between a family. They're all cousins,
Yeah.
right? So it was an
Absolutely.
interfamily squabble. And so that's very common. And they're going to track those genealogies for the marriages because they need to know they're putting the right fit in at the right levels. And it's very, very important. But Vlad the Impaler is the individual that Dracula is based on, which means son of a dragon. And
Mm,
as you take Dracula back to its etymological root in Greek, it's Drakont and Draconta, meaning a watcher. I mean, you can't get more
wow.
obvious, but it does, because Vlad the Impaler and his bloodline takes their genealogies back to a tribe of Scythians, which were Indo-Aryan giants after the flood. And it was the Egrathi tribe of Scythians, which was one of the tribes spawned by Hercules And so now you have that Herculides cretagens coming downstream, and he's got some sort of scion in there because he's going to be more from the LB gens versus the cretagens, but an ennobled scion would raise his pedigree.
Wow.
And so I can see why, based on that, he would tell the world that, because I'm higher than you think I am. You just don't know what I'm saying.
Right. And he loved that fact so much that he was living in Vlad the Impaler's castle for a long time.
Yeah.
Which it's mind blowing to me, you know.
Yeah, why would he do that?
Exactly. Why wouldn't he? You know,
Yeah.
And he was very, very, you're right. He was very, very public with that knowledge.
Very public with it. Yep.
So, and like you said, World War One, the King of England at the time, the Tsar of Russia, they were what, I believe, first or second cousins.
Yep.
And
German and all the intermarriage between the Kaisers,
yes,
Queen Victoria and Prince Albert and all of that time frame. And then you had, the Bourbon line of Spain. Of course, you had a war going on to topple them at that time. You also have the Habsburgs, again, all intermarrying between each other. You have the Anjou, who were the Italian bloodline, and
which is wild. All those people were related, like between first and third cousins.
And wrote each other all the time.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah,
and but it makes sense, you know, to try to compartmentalize, or I'm sorry, not compartmentalize, to try to keep all that power within that a certain small little group. But then again, you have, like, you know, the Hatfield and McCoy's type war they have going on between each other.
Well, yeah, and those rivalries boil over, right? So, because there can only be one at the end. There can only be one bloodline that's going to be the dragon messiah of the world that they're all positioning themselves to be. So they like to get rid of their bloodlines. Do you think creating with the Western secret societies created by the royals who populate the top half of the hierarchy of the secret societies, they created something called social masonry for a reason? Where was the first place they put it on? They put it on what they viewed was a bloodline that they were not going to get under control, the Western Europeans, and who viewed themselves as a higher bloodline. They sent it in to take down the Romanovs, which were a junior offshoot, like the Plantagenets is a junior offshoot through intermarriage of the Anjou. And so they were a junior offshoot through intermarriage in the 1600s from the Put-Yanin bloodline of Tsars that were rooted in Kiev. And these are pureblood Scythian Tuatha-De-Danann giant bloodlines that was more pure and less outside bloodlines than the Western European ones, and considered themselves superior. And so they created social masonry as a virus, and they launched it on Russia, and it took down that whole bloodline. And out of that war, you have the fall of the Kaiser dynasty. And then you have World War II coming up, and you have social masonry put into Spain to take down the Bourbon bloodline, or at least out of power for a while. And then after World War II and during, they put social masonry with Mao Zedong into China and take down the Shah dynasty of the original monarchs of the dragon creator gods. And they took down another powerful bloodline.
Is that when the Li family kind of rose up? Wow.
Yeah, there's two main families of the royal bloodlines, and there's a Western bloodline, and then there's a Eastern bloodline. The Li is more from the Eastern bloodline, and Xi, XI versus XIA for the Shah people and the Shah dynasty, is of the Western bloodline. So Xi is from the Western bloodline of the Shah royal bloodline, and he's back on and looking to rebuild his dynasty. And of course, Putin makes his claims back to the Put-Yanin dynasty as well through his grandfather, who was born out of out of illegitimate sex, out of marriage. And so in that tradition with the Putyanans of the Rurikid bloodline, you wouldn't put them out into poverty, so they would have some money, but you wouldn't give them the full name. You would only give part of the name. So Putin is part of the mix of Putyanin.
Wow.
And his father moves to St. Petersburg just before World War One, and that's how they end up in Russia. So when he's trying to take Kiev, he doesn't want to destroy Kiev because that's the holy city of the Putyanin bloodline.
Wow.
But he wants that empire back. And who does he commemorate with a statue in Moscow? That's one of their most famous statues of late. It's Vladimir the Great. Well, who's Vladimir the Great? He is the Putyanin royale who starts off the branch Moscow dynasty.
So that's his
in about 1000 AD. That's his hero.
You teach me something new every time you come on here, so it makes sense. He's trying to slice out his piece of that old world giant pie.
Yeah. So whether or not that's true, that his mythos that he put out when he was rising to power into the newspapers is accurate. He's using it, and I think he actually believes it. So again, it's what he's doing with that belief system that's important.
Right. And you said it earlier, it doesn't matter what we believe. It's whether they believe it. And I mean, he's managed to maintain his power for quite some time over there. And
oh yeah. And I think he's going to be there for a while, and probably till he dies. So
I believe so as well.
And he also knows, and he understands very, very well, because he took it quite personally when Gaddafi was overthrown, and he swore that will never happen to me. So he can't give up power because that just might happen to him.
You know, it's wild, the interweaving threads that these elites have, and you know, oh well, we got to conglomerate this power, but oh well, you know, our bloodline has to be a little bit ahead of this bloodline, so let's go ahead and start slicing them down.
And we get so localized in our thinking, and we need to think more worldly. And so North Americans, we look at the powerful Rockefellers and DuPonts and think those are the real bloodlines. No, they're way too visible. And they're called pseudo bloodlines, pseudo blue bloods. And they're pseudo because they're not really legitimate. So all of these families, whether or not it's the Morgans or the Carnegies or whoever you want to look at, these pseudo blue bloods, they were sponsored by the Rothschilds to be their stable of agents and put into business. And they're quite loyal to the Rothschilds. And that's why those names are also not only major corporate holders of industry, but of banking as well, because it's all part of the sort of mix. And so the Rothschilds aren't even super high up. They've been intermarrying over the generations. They actually changed their name to Rothschilds after they were sponsored to go into banking, and they set up the London Bank, and they changed it from the Bauer family to the Rothschilds. So when we look at the real bloodlines, these are old Western bloodlines. And there's one title that people should follow. I mean, I certainly think King Charles is a significant bloodline, but there's one individual who has the King of Jerusalem title that he's inherited, and that's King Philippe of Spain, Bourbon, inherited from Juan Carlos, passed over from the Habsburg Lorraine dynasties, and goes back to Baldwin II as the official first king of Jerusalem. But there's Baldwin I and de Bouillon in the time of the Templars and the taking of Jerusalem, and that's where that title has been passed down. And they believe they have the rights to the King of Jerusalem title in Jerusalem because not only are they Anjou bloodline, but they also have scioned into them bloodlines of King Saul. And Saul was a Benjamite, so a royale and a Benjamite. And in the time of Joshua, he awarded Jerusalem to the Benjamites.
Wow. So that's actually a legitimate claim, isn't it?
That's what, well, they say it's their legitimate claim, whether or not it
Yeah.
is or not, but
Whether yeah, whether or not
they say they have the genealogies and the evidence to produce it, to support it.
wow.
And so the Anjou is one of those leading families to be the Dragon Messiah, right?
That's
Just
spooky.
so you can't just say let's just go to King Charles. I mean, and there are other families too, older names. The older the families, and the Anjou is kind of a junior offshoot of the De Vere family.
The
Um,
bear. I don't think I'm
yeah.
familiar with the bear.
Well, that's when you're starting to get close to the original 13, right?
Wow.
And those are just the Western families. When we talk about the 13 families, there's said to be another 13 families around the world that's some of the top 13 would be part of in this larger world group.
So the ones that's projected to us, like the Freemans and, like you say, the Rockefellers and DuPonts and so forth. So those are like basically the help of these actual
Yes.
13.
Yes, the vassals, and they're in exchange they get to have their children intermarry into higher levels of bloodlines and become higher up in the hierarchy.
Wow. So it'd almost be beneficial to kind of look at their, like Carnegie's spouse or his wife back in the day, and
Yeah.
who her family was and whatnot. That
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Well, here's a classic example. So Pierre Trudeau is comes from one of the first families of Quebec from France. And who does he marry? Margaret Sinclair of the Sinclair clan of Scotland, who started Freemasonry, who is a transliterated name of St. Clair, that were part, and that name was taken by the Rollo family after the expropriation of Normandy in about 910 to 912 AD, and the Rollo bloodline goes back to Odin.
Wow. Odin, like Vodin, like the All Father of Norse mythology.
Yeah.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. And then, of course, we have, Justin Trudeau, who's supposedly the offspring of Margaret and Pierre, although there's a lot of rumors that there's another world leader that might have done that favor, so to speak.
He looks a lot like that world leader, brother.
Well, there is that. And they were personal friends with that world leader.
Right.
And so you see how this works, right?
Right.
It's a classic sort of example.
Yeah, it's very nefarious.
It is.
It's very, very nefarious. Like
it's how inside the family.
Yes.
It's always in the family. Yeah.
And if it weren't for astute brothers in the faith like you, who actually do the deep dives, because a lot of people think that, I'm the Rockefellers and the DuPonts, I have the secret information, and they're looking at the icing. They're not even to the actual cake yet.
Yeah. And the systems that they set up for control are just diabolical.
Yes.
Genius, but evil. And so if you look, when you looked at what happened in England, you had a system that was set up in their system where 99% of the land was owned by 1% of the population.
Wow.
And they controlled everything. And that 1% was all the nobility, the noble ones. And if you want to know what the definition of Aryan is, it's a noble one.
That's the definition of Aryan?
Yeah.
Huh.
As you take it back to Indo-Aryan, they were the noble ones.
Wow. So
they
don't
this may be
going a little bit off the map. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Gary.
I was just saying they don't hide who they are.
It doesn't seem like it.
If you're looking for it.
They're hiding in plain sight, it seems like. Well, I was going to take it to World War II, but I don't want to go that far off the map just yet.
Oh, we can go to World War II, sure.
So there's a lot of rumors about Hitler being a secret Rothschild, being the. So what was World War II actually like? Truly, under the surface, what was that to accomplish?
Well, let's just begin with Hitler as a royale. If he was, it's so insignificant. Not the MO to topple a royal bloodline and put some low-level bloodline person in place, right? That didn't happen in Russia. I mean, Maybe
That would make sense.
some
Yeah.
sort of nobility or educated class, but not a lot. That didn't happen in Spain in that revolution. Didn't
Right.
happen necessarily. So they don't want a rival. They want a puppet, right?
Right.
So National Socialism was created because of a problem that they created with communism to take down the Putin and Romanov bloodline, and it gets out of control. They start to do things that wasn't part of the plan, even though the Western bloodlines and the Western banks funded the communists, whether or not it was Lenin or Trotsky or Stalin. They were all being funded, but then they decided we're going to do things our own way. And now the Western bloodlines get concerned. So they decided what they would do with the problem of the Kaisers is let's just get rid of them and replace it and fund National Socialism to take care of communism. And then you get this Hitler. They were just looking for somebody when they drafted him into the Tula or the Thule Society who could be an orator. He could be, as we would understand it today, a tremendous speaker through a teleprompter. Right?
Right.
Right? Somebody who could be the face of the belief system, but he gets out of control too. So then they got to fund they got to fund the Western allies with the banking, take all the funding away from the Germans to try and stop that problem. And
Wow.
so it's such an effective weapon, but it's not a controllable weapon. But they certainly used it like a blunt instrument. So World
Absolutely.
War II is an extension out of World War I. It's really the same war. It's just sort of the conclusion. But when we look at World War II, this is a terrific analogy for the end time.
Right. The entirety of
And
the world at war. And
yeah, so when we look at what created National Socialism, and it is a left-wing belief system, not right-wing as we've been brainwashed to believe. They were
right.
the National Socialist Worker Party, and they combined oligarchs with socialism. So they're right of communism and anarchism, but they and pure socialism, but they're still of the left-wing progressive ideology. They're one of the same, and that's why progressivism went underground in North America after World War II for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And then they do this conversion of Nazis or National Socialism as being right wing, and then they can bring progressivism out from the left, and there's this separation that's been created for people who don't understand and history. So when we look at the creation of National Socialism, it's created through the secret societies. Particularly with Rosicrucian influence, but specific organizations like the Arnhem Order and the German Order, which is going to form the what is it? The German Order, very close to that, that is developing, and the Tula Society. These are all secret societies that are Gnostics and polytheists. And they have this religion that's been created in the 1880s by Blavatsky called Theosophy, but then they
Right.
overlay the Aryan and Vril and Volkish ideologies on it and call it Ariosophy. So in 1933, where you have the Reichschurch that is created, this is that ancient universal religion of the giants that's part of all the beast empires and was the Enochian mysticism before the flood, or the same religion as Atlantis. Now the
Whoa.
Führer, it comes out of, I think, Wagner, and it's like a messiah type of leader that he's going to accept the title. So now you have a polytheist religion being forced over the German people. You have a messiah type figure in times in Hitler, who wants to create the Third Reich, 1,000-year reign, or a counterfeit
Right.
millennium. And so they're funded into business before the funding stops. But what happens is there's a transition in all of this occult religion and societies as they're in contact with spirit guides, the celestial white masters. There's a whole bunch of different names, aliens, whoever they're talking to at whatever level, they're being provided knowledge to create things for war. So they're going to be able to create like the Tiger and Panzer tank.
Right. The
And
real handmaidens, I
yeah,
think they claim were providing them. They were some sort of oracles or something,
yeah,
contacting
they're in
this. Yeah.
contact and giving the technology. And so, you know, it had heavier capability in terms of its destruction capability, but it was really the design that you could have shells from the standard tanks deflecting right off of it. And it's the
Yeah.
same model that's used up to this day in terms of the standard sort of prototype. They've improved it, but that was revolutionary. And you're going,
Absolutely.
okay, well, how did they get that? They had no army.
Uh,
They were running out of money. And then they created the rocket engine. Then they created the jet engine. And then they created the single winged aircraft. And they created the ability to, they were trying to create a nuclear weapon, and they had missile capabilities that they were developing to take it to the whole world in some sort of bell shaped things. And so as
yeah,
we start to
Diglocka.
look, yeah, they developed a blitzkrieg strategy, which people say, well, that's nothing new. Well, there was no blitzkrieg strategy before, and there wasn't the weapons to do what they were doing before. It
Exactly.
came out of nowhere, and none of the allies knew how to do it and had their butts kicked on the east and the west until they
You know,
figured
Gary,
out how.
it's crazy watching those videos of like us in prop planes, and
Yeah,
you'll hear the pilots. They're like, "Whoa, what was that?" You
yeah,
hear the commander like, "Get off the radio." They're
yeah,
flying past us in jets, and we're still in prop planes.
yeah. And
That's scary. That's scary stuff.
had they had enough time and capacity to produce more, they
Yeah.
probably they might have won the war. Likely would have won the war because it was they would just take out so much in terms of the casualty consequence when they attacked that you couldn't, if they had enough, and it wouldn't have been that much more to tip the war. So
Yeah.
that's kind of an analogy for the end time, because you have a Holocaust there as well, and we're going to see persecution of the saints, and you have this Babylon type religion, and you have this Antichrist type figure trying to bring in a millennium era, and you have this rapid advancement of technology that we're seeing another rapid advancement of technology
Yes, we
today.
are. Yeah.
And this is very similar to what happened before the flood.
Wow. It gives me chill bumps. Gary Wayne,
It
you're
should.
absolutely right.
So their plan has been to take National Socialism to make it a global socialism. So National Socialism on a globalist scale for the world going forward. That's what they've been trying to organize. And so that's why they're against nationalism, because it's, you can't just sort of war with the whole world and take over. You need a better way of creating a world empire. And so they're trying to do it through, a world government that's working together as opposed to done by war. But to get there, they're going to have a lot of wars to create these empires, is what we're seeing, because the other bloodlines don't see it the same way as the Europeans do. So they're not against this world empire. They just want a larger role, and they see it structured differently. So that's what you see with Putin. He's not against the New World Order. He's just saying, I want a bigger role. Xi is saying the same thing. And actually, Trump is saying the same thing. And that if we look at sort of looking in history, back before the flood, we had an Atlantean empire that had 10
Right.
kings in its empire, 10 parts of the world that was trying through war to create a world government with its Atlantean Enochian mysticism. And so when the occult religions talk about the New Age, it's a golden age. It's the New Age of Atlantis, as Francis Bacon wrote about. And this,
Extensively, yeah.
yeah, where you have this one religion that harmonizes with science, and the government to create this new era. And so they're trying to establish these 10 kings and this universal religion in preparation for the end time. And so Trump may not necessarily be an antichrist figure, but through whether he is or whether he isn't sort of part of the inside or not, he's still doing things that's moving us in a similar sort of direction. So when he's talking about his golden age, and he's talking about building a larger empire, essentially, that'll go from probably the Panama Canal. You could probably take it right through to England to give him the proper circle of defense and strategic locations that would be required. That might be one of the 10 of the end time.
Certainly seems so.
Yeah, that Daniel 2 and Daniel 7 and Revelation 12, 13, and 17 talk about.
And I believe that as well. And when I saw him, and it seemed like it was tongue in cheek talking about taking Canada by force or whatever, military force. It's like, okay, you're not going to do that. But when you hear that kind of stuff even being spoken about an American president, then if strategically, like you said, if we took back the Panama Canal and everything up from that, Canada and then Greenland, if you were to look at that on a map, you could kind of start sectioning off regions of the world. So
and
makes a lot of sense.
And the Club of Rome that was created in the late 60s, and you can Google this, they were created to speed up this process because it's taking way too long. And the occult forces are always frustrated because they're trying to do things before the ordained times. And so they keep doubling down. But they're going to get there eventually. So we need to be aware of that as well. So the Club of Rome divided the world into 10 groups of nations. And you can Google that and get it. And the United Nations has us divided up into 10 groups as well, a little bit different than the Club of Rome. And so the 10 is going to happen. It's going to be these economic zones and military zones out of necessity. Probably will be the key thing, and catastrophes and wars. And so I think what Trump is doing, whether or not intentionally or unintentionally, he wants to create a zone where he's going to have protection against the Europeans, because he looks at them as not being as friendly for his way, because they'd like to get rid of him, because he's upsetting their New World Order plans in terms of the way they would like to have it. He sees Russia rising. He sees China rising. And he's seeing, how do I position the United States to have a larger position and to be able to compete and have dominance, not just to be part of the 10. He's still looking at, how do I keep the U.S. the dominant force? So that's going to take something significant. And one of the reasons why I take that right over to England. And you're going to need a bloodline. So might as well be England, as I speculate. Yeah.
I never thought about that part, but that's a part of the legitimizing of it, right?
Yeah.
They have to have that one of those bloodlines that trace back, I guess.
Yeah. So when Trump is talking about, Canada as a state, he's just trolling, and he's really looking to get a better economic association. Right, is really where that would sort of end up at. And then you get access to a better access to all of the resources that he wants. Right. And so Greenland, not only does he want that for military bases, but he also wants access to all of those minerals as well that's in Greenland.
Absolutely. That, and I mean, they're just a stone's throw away from Russia. So the dynamic between Russia and the United States would be completely different than what it is now.
Yep. So I'm not sure where we went with that, so I'll just sort of continue to talk.
Oops, sorry about that. I accidentally
okay, yeah, no,
hit the wrong button.
I would have just filled the air and talk. I said, I don't know what's going on, but I'm just going to continue to talk and keep on with the conversation.
I appreciate that, Gary. You'd have had my back, but and I apologize. I know folks you're seeing me like mute out a lot. I actually have COVID. So for you praying folks, say a prayer for me if you would. But I wasn't gonna miss a show with my friend Gary Wayne here. It's always a pleasure having you on the channel, sir.
Well, I can sympathize with the COVID because I had it last year and I had to go through a couple of months of where I was a bit foggy and not all that energetic.
Yeah, it's I'm at the end of it now, thank God. But it's been a rough one.
Yeah. Yeah, it's no fun.
No, sir. But jumping back into it, the and this is all gonna happen because the Bible says it's going to. You know, the 10 kings and whatnot.
Yep.
How close do you think we are to that?
Well, I do think we're in the fig tree generation that Jesus talks about. But I think we're still in the sorrows, and we don't know how long a generation is, and we need the start
Right.
date to that fig tree generation. So if I were to pick a start to it, I would focus in on that fig tree allegory. And in the Old Testament, prophetic allegory for the northern tribes was used as the vine, and for the fig tree or figs for the southern kingdom. So that's important to understand, just as in Jeremiah talks about the southern kingdom as being there's good figs and there's bad figs. That's part of the multiple passages calling them that. So when Jesus was, before he gives his Olivet oration with the signs of the time that has the sorrows in there that I was talking about, as you go back a couple chapters into Matthew, and just before he goes into the temple to do his prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple because they're about to crucify and violate the Holy Covenant by rejecting their Messiah and crucifying him, he goes up to a fig tree, grabs a fruit, eats it, and then kills the tree and says, this fig tree no longer bears fruit. The disciples, all being Jewish, would have understood clearly who he was talking about through the allegory of the prophetic allegory. And then he goes in and does the prophecies in Jerusalem and the mayhem that he causes there in the temple. And then by the time they get to where they're going to the Olivet, is that they're going to say, what's going on? Tell us about the end time. Tell us about the signs of your second coming, because we're getting quite concerned. So when you see the fig tree in bloom again, is the fig tree generation. Jesus talks about this in those sort of terms, that all of the events that I'm talking about will be fulfilled. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. So in 1947, Israel was created as a nation state, and the southern kingdom of the Jewish people had started to move back there. So that's one possible start date. But one of the main epicenters of end time prophecy is Jerusalem. So the southern kingdom has to be in complete control of Jerusalem. And they didn't get even partial control of Jerusalem until 1967. So I would say, well, maybe that's a better start date. And then we don't know how long a generation is. It could be a 40 years in the wilderness, could be 7 years as the book of Psalms talks about, could be 120 years that Genesis 6:3 talks about. But if it's in the 70-year zone, we're starting to come up to that. 40's already gone by from that. And we should be seeing part of the sorrows happen. And what's the sorrows? That is wars and rumors of war, and they get stronger as we go. It's going to be earthquakes, and they get stronger as they go, and more often. It's going to be pestilence, and that's going to become more common and stronger as we go. And it's going to be famine, and they will all start to work together. And so that's what we're just starting to see now. And the wars and the rumors of war, I think, is going to become about through the jockeying of position to create these 10 empires. And how you get a chain reaction of whatever the US is doing, whatever the Europeans are doing, the Russians and China. And you basically have at least 4 or 5 groups of nations right there in the makeup in terms of how they're going to respond. And the rest of the world has to respond. So you have to have an African confederation, and you're going to have at least maybe part of Central America that goes with South America, or but certainly South America will be one, and we'll see how far it sort of moves up. You're going to have probably a group that's going to be formed around Japan and in that region in opposition against China.
Right.
So India is going to have a play on its own, and Iran and the Persians, and you could classify Iraq, Iran, and India as Persian, whether it's all one. I don't see it as being all one, but maybe two different ones. And you see them starting to work together.
Which is very odd.
Which is very odd. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, India, I mean, they have almost decoupled from the West. And they
Yeah.
never criticize what China or Russia is doing or what Iran is doing. But that's because they require the energy resources and oil and other energy products from Russia. So they're going to be part of that. And you have, I think, a split coming in Europe. I think you're going to have Germany with a Central European sponsored one that's going to go with the Eastern group. And Germany has no choice. We're not building pipelines or doing anything to supply Germany. They're going to have to go with this other group. So there's an interesting group of nations that are talked about in that war that happens just before the midpoint of the last 7 years in the Gog War. That's the Joel 1 and 2 and the Revelation 9 war of 200 million man army that it talks about there. And it's led by Gog of Magog, the chief prince of Meshech. And of course, Gog is a giant, right?
Right.
It's a Gog's name is a giant. And we don't even get his mention except for in the Gog War prophecies there and in Revelation 20 with the one at the end of the millennium. But he's the offspring of Iapetus, a parent god of Greek mythology, along with Magog. So Magog seems to be a giant name taken over by one of the descendants of Japheth. And you have these giant names used after the flood as well, which is also common. And we probably covered off in one of the last two shows that we did. And Meshech is the etymological root for Moscow.
Wow.
Now, who else is in there? We have Persia. That's a significant part of that alliance. And you also have a bunch of North African nations that are in there as well. So I'm thinking that's going to be part of, we get 5 that might be on one foot and then 5 on another foot of a split in the end time for the 10 kings. So let's just, for sake of simplicity, 10 from the east, 10 from the west. It won't quite be that because you got north and south to contend with. And we'll see who aligns with who. But I think it's going to be aligning like that, just as we see these BRIC nations starting to work together. And they're already creating their own currency, their own banking, their own credit cards. They're becoming self-contained with energy and doing business with each other. And I think we're starting to see that form. So I would be looking to see some wars break out as that happens to put that into place. And that's just going to drive the other nations around the world to form their own groups and get it formalized. And obviously the US and the Europeans are going to be the first to respond to these things that are rising between Russia, Iran, India, and China. And they'll be responding in kind to, for protection, because if you're going to be up against empires that are aligned, you're going to have to be very powerful. And if you're seeing it through the lens of Trump from a strategic perspective, as he starts to see this, he's going to say, I still want to be dominant, but now I want to be the dominant empire, and I'll work with the Europeans, for example, but they're not going to call the shots.
Right. And that makes sense, the way things are. And you're right, especially in the past, 3 to 5 years on the world stage, alliances are happening that you thought you'd never see 5 to 10 years previous to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely is something you can feel it on a spiritual level. There's something going on.
It is. And I think that it's starting to happen because we're in the fig tree generation. And now if you start to combine some other catastrophes that might happen as this happens, that can feed war and change, earthquakes can get strong and have significant destruction and can be an
Sure.
epicenter for pestilence, right? That would come out of it. And wars and catastrophes will also drive shortages of food, which can drive famine. You have enough famine and disease plaguing the world, and you're going to have nations saying, we need to feed our people and we need to get rid of these diseases. So we're going to do whatever we have to do to get rid of the source of the disease and to be able to feed our people. And now that's when the wars really kick in.
Yeah. I mean,
Let alone the economic disasters that come with it.
Sure. I mean, that they all can be, they're all intertwined. I
Yes.
see exactly what you're saying.
And I think these are all contrived catastrophes. This isn't judgment coming down from God. It doesn't ever say it's judgment from God.
Right.
This is God letting us do it to ourselves.
That makes sense. It makes all the sense in the world. And I'm glad you said that. A lot of people think when we read these things, okay, this is what God's doing to us.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. You're right. It's the natural unfolding of what we're doing because we have dominion here.
Yeah. The only one I think you can make a argument for would be the wrath bowls in the year of the Lord's wrath, where it's being poured out, but it's not being poured out onto his people.
Right.
They are protected, both the church and Israel, from that. But that doesn't mean before the year of the Lord's wrath, there isn't significant tribulation that we have to go through.
There's some of our brothers and sisters believe that we're not to be touched by any tribulation.
I know.
And it's unfortunate because that's not what the Bible says, you know?
Yeah. So there's in each of the 6 letters to the churches, and most people don't look at this from a prophetic perspective, there are some unfulfilled prophecies. And that's not unusual in this dual prophecy scenario that I talk about that has ancient prehistory information. It has prophecies for the time of the prophet, and this time John, and John takes the letters back to the churches and things are applicable to them, but not everything is fulfilled in each of those. And then a dual prophecy has events that are filled in the end time. It's similar to Deuteronomy 32. It's similar to the Assyrian in Isaiah 14. It's similar to Tyrus in Ezekiel 28. These are all types of dual prophecies that have the same kind of MO. And so when we look at some of the things, I won't go through them all, but there's let's say in Revelation 2, 10, it talks about 10 days of tribulation for that church. They didn't get 10 years of tribulation. Didn't happen. Unfulfilled. So we might want to look at an additional 3 years of very much a problematic time when Babylon is rising and killing the saints before the start of the last 7 years as dictated by Daniel 9:27 for the 7 years. And then the timing in Revelation where you have like the 2 witnesses for 3.5 years preaching, and then you have the reign of Antichrist for 3.5 years, just to sort of quickly get those 3.5 years in place for the 7 years. So you could have 10 years that include the last 7 and 3 before, because you have the tribulation of the saints and you have the great tribulation not seen since the beginning of creation. That lines up as the same word for tribulation and affliction as is used in the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew sarah for trouble in the time of Jacob's trouble that they're going to be saved out of. It's the time of trouble in Daniel 12, Sarah 12:1, where there's a special resurrection and judgment for Israel's people. That's the fulfillment with the second Exodus and the resurrection in Ezekiel 37. I know I'm moving quickly to sort of get to the point, but the other one that is not fulfilled in Revelation is 3, and to another church, and they're going to be saved out of the time of trial or temptation. That didn't happen. No. So there's at least one of these types of things in each of those letters to the 7 churches. And so that hour of trial is very interesting as well, because that's the same word hora, hour, that's used for the hour of Babylon's destruction in Revelation 14, with a summary of the last 3.5 years after the 144,000 first fruits are seen in Edmonton, or in Edmonton in heaven.
In Edmonton.
Edmonton's not heaven. I used to live there. It's a good place, but it's not heaven.
Yeah.
And so not sure how that came out, but and that it's part of the resurrection sequence, the Christ, the first fruits, and then when he comes, right?
Right.
So, and then you get the preaching of the gospel in Revelation 14, then you get the summary of the last 3.5 years. So you can take Revelation 6 to Revelation 14 to about verse 7, overlay that on the first half of Jesus' chronology, and then take the last events of Revelation, using that summary as the main events, and then the details from 15 to 19 over the last 3.5 years, and you can start to fit things in. So that hour, as we look at that, is part of the hour of the destruction of Babylon, where we're told to come out of before it gets destroyed, and before Antichrist destroys Babylon, as recorded in Revelation 17, when in 1 hour, there's going to be a time of 1 hour when the 10 kings hand their power over to Antichrist, who then destroy Babylon. So that's the same hour that's being talked about, all Greek hora. This is the hour that nobody knows when Jesus is coming back.
Wow.
If you let prophecy speak for itself and put like passages together, everything starts to make sense. And for people
I've never thought about that before. That does make sense.
Yeah, and for people who say there's no order in Revelation, or you can't make sense of it, or it doesn't fit what Jesus said necessarily, well, that's not possible, because Revelation is, as it's written in Revelation 1, it is the testimony of Jesus given in a vision to the angel to show John. How could it be in conflict with the chronology that he provides in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, and 21? If that doesn't match up, then we can't really count on anything. It's going to have to be perfect, because it all comes from the Word of God.
Right. And just the point that you said, like layering these like scriptures on top of each other, like, you know, the hour that no one knew that Jesus is coming back, with that hour of destruction, that they give all their crowns to the Antichrist. That makes sense, because the Antichrist has all this power now. Now it's time for the captain of our salvation to come back. That makes sense. And
everything has to fit without conflict. But when you start to overlay a preconceived hoping for, and let's pray for a pre-trib rapture, let's prepare for a mid-trib or later, just to be safe. But here's something that I would encourage people to do is look at the chronology that Jesus lays down. And how do we know it's in chronological order? Because he uses the word then, as it's recorded in the Greek. And that's the Greek word toda. It means exactly that. And then this. It's the when. It's at that time. It's chronological. And it gives us the abomination at the middle, and then instructs us to read Daniel to understand all about that time frame and the meaning of what's going on with the abomination. And then you have the second 3.5 years, when the great tribulation, not seen since creation, begins. And that's really kind of weird, because if you look at Mark 13:19, it's talking about the same thing, not seen since the beginning of creation, but it doesn't say tribulation. It says affliction. But it still goes to the same Greek word, thalipses, that's used in the tribulation of the saints in Revelation 7, that the first fruit martyrs are talking about in Revelation 6, being told to wait a little season for these saints to come out of the tribulation, which is going to be part of the first fruits. That also includes those 144,000 that I talked about in Revelation 14, and the 2 witnesses, right? And so now when we look at that, well, you got 2 different words there. What does that tell us about what Jesus talks about in Matthew for this great affliction? Same word as in Mark. That's thalipses as well. where we're going to be martyred for the testimony of Jesus, just as those in Revelation 7 are. So now we have a chronology and a
With
complete
backing scripture.
symmetry, of matching scripture, and knowing that affliction and tribulation are the same thing in these prophecies, because it was written for us not to confuse. And we either have a purposeful confusion of the translation or just bad translation. I'll let people sort of decide. But here's the thing: people will say, but Matthew doesn't say there's a rapture there. Well, one of the things I would encourage people to do is this. We have the sign in Jesus. It comes after the abomination. Now put all the additional details that aren't listed in Matthew, but use Matthew as your template. Put all the additional details of Mark, overlay onto Matthew, and then Luke 17 and 21. And it's going to give you the rest of the details. And then when you look at when Jesus' sign is set up after the abomination, and he's going to send out his angels to collect the elect from the four corners of the earth. Now read what Mark says on that. He adds on, and he's going to take that elect to heaven.
Yeah.
But people leave Mark out because it doesn't fit the preconceived conclusion.
And just
you
like you
can't
said,
do that. It's
preconceived
got to
conclusion.
fit.
Yeah.
It's got to fit.
I think that, and I've been guilty of this in the past before, we have this comic book style way of reading the Bible where we're reading it as, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
As panel to panel separate stories. But, you know, when I had my Sunday school class, I tell those kids, like, the Bible doesn't say read to show thyself approved unto God. It says study to show thyself approved unto God. And I'm glad that you illustrated that, because you're absolutely right. We have to get out of this, you know, from cover to cover reading of the Bible and then having an understanding in these compartmentalized ways.
Yeah. And then we try and say, well, it wasn't in chronological order. It's topical order, because to recognize it, it's in chronological, even though the language says that, it blows apart so many other things that they can't sort of deal with. Yeah. And one other piece of advice I would provide people is to overlay what the prophets say on prophecy onto Jesus's chronology, not vice versa. Mm. He is, the testimony, Jesus is the spirit of prophecy, right?
Yes.
As he talked. And so all things come from him on it. So a lot of people like to redefine what Jesus said by what the other prophet said. No, you define what the prophet said by what he said. Don't get it in the wrong order. And another thing I would encourage Christians to do is not to apply church prophecies when they're clearly made out by name to Judah or Israel. Apply those to the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And because there's a parallel track on prophecy, they're going to have a nexus point. But if you start to do that, then you get confused. So people will say, well, I'm going to use Daniel 1 as part of my understanding of the resurrections. And well, you can't do that, because that's for Daniel's people. That's not for the church. Right. And the timing doesn't fit a pre-trib rapture anyways, because that's mid-trib. And even though it's mid-trib, I don't use it for mid-trib rap, because it's not for the church. It's for the resurrection of Israel in Ezekiel 37 and the dry bones. People think that's a crazy passage. It's not. It's the reconciliation of Israel that has to happen before Armageddon. And so when we look at markers from the Old Testament, we're looking at things that we can connect into the New Testament on prophecy. So keep an eye on trumpet blasts in Old Testament prophecy, because it'll show you a marker. If you have a trumpet blast that's not a prophecy, don't worry about it. But if it's in an Isaiah prophecy and there's a trumpet blast, that's a marker for the time of the trumpets. And there's an interesting number of passages where trumpets and variations of the sign in the Old Testament are used. And so you have words like ensign, banner, standard. And typically in a lot of these passages where it's talking about these banners and standards and ensigns being set on the mountain or in the sky in the end time, this is all the same timing as when Jesus puts up his sign in the
Wow.
days of the last trumpet.
It's amazing.
It all comes together if you let it. But people will say, well, you can't use a trumpet as a marker.
I think there's a lot of resistance to it because people, I mean, it's frightening to a lot of people.
Well, it's that simple, though. I mean, God wants us
Sure.
to understand, and we just have to let him understand. So, and test it out, but don't use a passage that's not clearly a prophecy from the Old Testament to try and keep prophecy with prophecy, and don't confuse that there's a trumpet in the Old Testament that is for the church. You can use it for timing, but remember, those are prophecies for Israel and for Judah. And don't confuse Israel and Judah. They're two separate nations that will come back as one stick in Ezekiel 37, but after that, then you might want to make that case. And so when we start to understand what is the year of the Lord's favor, that's also part of what happens with the reconciliation of Israel and Judah after Israel has been awakened, after Judah has recognized the one that they pierced, after the midpoint, in the time of Jacob's trouble, when both David and Jesus will lead them in second Exodus to the
Both
wilderness.
David and Jesus.
Yes. It's in the prophecies in the Old Testament, including Jacob's trouble, Jeremiah 30 and 31 with the second Exodus prophecies there, and in Ezekiel 37. And also Jesus is in Micah 5 and 2 in the time of the Assyrian. He's called the breaker. He's going to break the Israelites and the Judeans around the world out of the prisons and then lead them in second Exodus.
Wow. It's so much like, and I know you're giving just the footnotes of how to, letting people know how to approach it.
Yes.
But I mean, each and every level of it it's pretty deep. I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, you buy Mr. Gary Wayne's book if you would like to know more about this stuff. The Genesis 6 Conspiracy Part 2.
Yeah, because I have two sections on that, and I demonstrate my approach there, and people can agree or disagree with it, but I can take any passage in prophecy and just flip it in. So,
which is awesome.
Yeah, so when I'm talking with people and they're using something out of context, I can bring the reasons why it's out of context, but why don't you fit it in here? That's where the jigsaw pieces fit, and here's why.
That's why I love reading your books. You give and you put an emphasis on the "and here's why" part.
Yeah,
so you really flesh it out to where if somebody was being intellectually honest again and they read it, they would say, "Wow, where's the argument at?" Because I mean, you take it back to the source material and everything, and you really explain how to read the source material correctly.
Yeah. And a lot of people will say, well, tribulation and wrath are the same things. Well, no, they're two different words. There's actually two words used that are translated for wrath in the New Testament, thumos and orge, and tribulation is thlipsis. They can be used at times in the same passage, but that they're talking about two different things. One, tribulation is for the saints. Wrath is for the non-believers.
Right. And it seems, I don't know, maybe it's because I am a believer, but it seems like that's obvious when you read it. I've heard people conflate the two though, you know, believer and non-believer, which is wild. But Mr. Gary Wayne, it has been a pleasure as always. God bless you. I appreciate you coming back. Can't wait to have you back on here. I could do this for hours, sick or not. But ladies and gentlemen, buy both books. Look up Gary's name on Amazon and buy everything you see, because this guy, he's going to help you understand what you're reading. No doubt about it. Yeah, Mr. Wayne was you got the last word, sir.
Yeah, and I want to thank you for that, and it will challenge your previous points of view on things, and that's
sure.
Always good. but you're going to know how and why I make the points that I do, and you can decide. But if you're tired of having prehistory and prophecy as a mystery or obscure, or prophecy why you can't get your head around it, or how do I get rid of these conflicts I can't resolve, you'll see how that works. And it doesn't mean that you won't have to do more work afterwards, but now you got a starting point.
Absolutely. And with your first book as well, you give so much detailed information, but you can take that information as full as it is and use it as a building block to then move forward and reading the Bible, which is phenomenal. Again, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Gary Wayne, one of the greatest biblical teachers on planet Earth today, in my humble opinion. I sincerely appreciate you coming back, brother. It's always a blast. And we look forward to you stopping back through.
Absolutely. I will.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Y'all have a great night, and we'll see you next time.